So, in first aid, the very first word we have in the book is relax. We want you to think about this as a deliberate journey, a marathon, in terms of preparing for this, one-day exam. We know it can be stressful. We can know it can be frustrating in terms of preparing for. But if you take the time to plan it through, you can minimize those issues and hopefully come out better for it on the other side. All right, so let's talk about the outline. We're going to be talking a little bit about the basics. We're going to be talking about defining your goal. Things are changing all the time with the USMLE, so we'll provide a couple quick updates, provide timelines for studying, how to approach the subjects, choosing prep resources, some general study advice. We'll talk a little bit about some of the things we do, like RX Coach and RX Bricks. We do have a raffle and a special offer tonight. You do need to stick around to qualify. We'll be drawing the names towards the very end of this webinar, and then we also will have some open Q&A where we'll take some of your questions live, during the webinar. In addition to obviously, what Sean and Ross will be answering in the chat. All right, so let's start off with a question. I want to know who's out there tonight. So I am going to launch a poll, and here's the first one. I want to know who you are. So you should be seeing a question come across your screen, and you should be able to respond. So take a second to click a button, and then we'll collect the results. Should come in about next 20-30 seconds. Then we'll be able to share that with everyone. All right, looks like about a fourth of you, a third of you have answered, close to a half of you have answered. We'll leave it open for a couple more seconds. Once we get about maybe 70% of you. All right, looks like 3/4 of you have answered. Perfect. I'm going to share the results, and what you see here is that majority of the folks here tonight are international students. We obviously have some US students as well too, so welcome. All right, now we want to see and know when do you plan on taking the step 1? Is it sometime soon, or after the exam becomes pass-fail? So again, we'll leave this open for a couple 30 seconds. Now remember that it's going to go pass-fail at the end of January at the earliest. So let's see what folks say. All right, we're at about 30%. And 50%. A couple more seconds here. All right, I think we're close to 70%, so I think that's good enough. Let me share the results here, and we are seeing a big chunk of folks who are going to be taking after January. Makes sense, particularly for the M2s and also anybody who is going through a normal academic cycle to be taking at that time in the springtime. All right. Perfect. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and hide that poll. All right, good to know. All right, so let's talk about the USMLE Step 1. It is a one-day exam, 8 hours total. There's 280 questions in 7 one-hour blocks. There are 40 questions per block, and you get a minimum of 45 minutes of break time. All right. Now in each block, and because it's 40 questions per block, you get roughly 90 seconds per question. You can see here a schematic, of the 7 blocks. The red block here is the orientation block, and you're actually given 15 minutes to finish that. But the key thing to know here is that this orientation block is the same orientation you get when you download the USMLE software from their website and install it on your computer. So if you obviously do that orientation beforehand and just go into the block at the Prometric Testing Center just to adjust your headphones, which should only really take 20-30 seconds, you should be able to get close to an extra 15 minutes of break time, and you should be able to push up your total break time essentially to 1 hour. The other thing to note, and I'll remind you later, is you finish any of these blocks early, before your hour is up, all that remaining time also becomes part of your break time. All right. So let's talk about the question types. On the exam, there's only one type of question. It's a single best answer. Now, some of the questions will have multimedia, so maybe video or audio, but it's a handful. It's not a ton. Most of the questions are case-based, and they make them. As I mentioned, they make up most of the exam, and they have a lot of the questions, roughly half or more, will require multi-step reasoning. So what do I mean by that? That means they will integrate multiple related concepts. So it may start off with pathology, so what's going on, but then go to genetics or a biochem concept that may be tied to mechanism of disease or something with therapeutics, or class effects that goes along with it. And so here's an example of a two-step question. A 32-year-old Caucasian woman who presents with a 5-day history of occasional double vision and bilateral ptosis. What is the most appropriate diagnostic test? So when you look at this question, you automatically will try to, as you can tell, as you're probably doing right now, try to come up with a diagnosis. But that's not what they're asking about. They're asking about what is the best diagnostic test to make that diagnosis that you're thinking about, right? So you have to have some sort of clinical suspicion. And so step one is what's the most likely diagnosis? And then step two, that's the second step, then what is the most appropriate diagnostic test? So that's an example of a two-step question. On the USMLE, you will see questions like that, or three-step questions, or problem-solving questions where they give you some data, particularly when it comes to maybe some biostats or epidemiology, and you got to do a simple calculation, or maybe there's a physio calculation, and then you apply that to the test scenario or the clinical scenario. All right, so this is the interface for the USMLE. It's a very simple interface. You can see here is the question, or they call it the STEM, right? So typically it's the case setup here involving the 73-year-old woman, then followed by the question, or in their parlance, the lead-in, which of the following is most likely diagnosis. You've got a number of choices, a minimum of 4 choices, typically 5, but you can also go to 6, 7, or 8 choices, and you can get some sort of image that goes along with it, 15 to 20% of the time. You've got all your navigation at the top and on the side, and then you got your timer at the bottom, and then you can exit the block. And there's an opportunity to lock the block as well too, like if you need to go use the restroom in the middle of a block. But just remember the timer is still running. And again, as I mentioned, if you exit the block before you finish your 60 minutes, then the remaining time goes into your break time. All right. So scoring and passing, right? So this is going to obviously stay relevant for the next 4 or 5 months here. But currently, passing is at 194. They are reevaluating that. They'll make any announcements about how that might work out, particularly with pass-fail, in the next couple of months. The mean is around 230. It bounces around 229, 230, maybe 231, depends on the cohort. Standard deviation has been pretty stable at around 20 points. Most U.S. medical students will pass on their first try, and for IMGs, most will pass within 3 tries. All right, so that's the good news. So the issue, therefore, for most folks, it's not passing or failing. It's going to be the score, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. Here we see is the percentiles. We took the data that USMLE published on their website, usmle.org, and we put it into a graph, so you can clearly see that from a percentile standpoint, it levels off at around 275. So you rarely see folks getting scores higher than 270, 275. And then you can see the minimum pass-fail threshold currently at 194, right? And again, that might get shifted a little bit. We'll see, in the coming months with USMLE. And again, the median, is roughly again, at 230. All right. In terms of defining your goals, in first aid, we like to keep it simple. We think about passing the exam, so scoring comfortably above the pass-fail threshold, beating the mean, so that's 230 or above to 249, or acing the exam, which is technically about 1 standard deviation. So that's the 250 that sometimes you hear classmates talk about when they want to be competitive for certain specialties, such as radiation oncology, radiology, the surgical subspecialties, like ophtho, ortho, otolaryngology, urology, aesthetic, which is plastics, and dermatology. So you can see nicely summed up by this mnemonic here, roads to riches. And so that's a little bit about the scoring there. And speaking of scoring, as I mentioned, they are still planning on doing pass-fail in January. We haven't heard anything differently. If that changes, we'll let you know. But it will be no earlier than January the 26th. And when they do go pass-fail, all the scores that we're taking prior to that pass-fail date will continue to get reported on the USMLE transcripts. If you are an osteopathic student, and I did see a couple DO students out there, that exam will go pass-fail shortly thereafter, later this spring. All right, great. So now let's talk about some data from the National Residency Matching Program about what does the scores mean, or how do they correlate with where people match. As you can see here, this is median USMLE Step 1 scores by matched US students. You can see that the median scores, are bouncing. This is 218, a couple of years old, but still relevant. Are bouncing around the 220s, as to be expected, for the major specialties, including emergency medicine, general surgery. But then they start moving up. Well, actually, general surgery is a little bit above average, internal medicine is a little bit above average. And then once you get into things like diagnostic radiology, ophtho, otolaryngology, you see that the scores are clearly in the 240s, getting towards even 250, right, with plastics, right? And my brother, for example, was facial plastic, he did ENT and so forth. So that is fairly competitive. Now this is an old graph, but I want to show it for a purpose. If you are a U.S. medical student, and I know it's maybe about 20% of the folks that are here tonight, as long as you pass, and even if you fail the first time, your probability of matching into one of your desired specialties, as long as it's not super competitive like otolaryngology, is still pretty high, right? And again, this is old data. They stopped publishing this graph type a couple of years ago, but we believe the pattern still persists. If you are going into otolaryngology, but you're not scoring well, you can see there is a steep, there's a bit of a drop-off curve. Doesn't go to zero, right? Even if you're, back then, this, the average was closer to 210 to 20. This data is about 10 years old. You can still have greater than 50-50 average, 50-50 chance of matching. But if you're an IMG, it's you can see it's a little more competitive, and you can see that the chances are actually are lower along more of the curve. So that's what you need to keep in mind. All right. So with that, I want to pause there and ask the group a question, which is, based on what I just showed, what is your step 1 goal, especially while it's still scored? I know that you won't really know after January, but where do you think you want to end up? All right, so we'll go ahead and collect some data, and remember, there is no wrong answer. I went to University of California, San Francisco, fairly competitive medical school, but a lot of folks were really considering primary care, and and so several folks said, what, really doesn't matter. They passed. They didn't really try for anything, all that competitive, and they were perfectly fine. So so let me go ahead and share the results, and we see it's kind of 50-50. Half want to ace the exam, half want to beat the average. And again, after January, this is going to be a moot thing, particularly for the 30 to 40% of you folks that are going to be taking it February and beyond. All right, let me go ahead and collapse that poll. Let's go on to the next slide here. All right, so let's talk about timelines for studying here, right? So in first aid, we try to keep things simple. We talk about just passing, where it could be 1 to 2 months of dedicated study time. We highly recommend first aid as a umbrella framework for organizing your studies. Obviously, we're a little biased towards it. And then supplementing with crammable subjects, we'll talk a little bit about that, and doing question banks, at least doing a couple of question banks. If you are, either trying to get that 250, or, if you've had a problem with, standardized tests in the past, you might need to spend more time, right? And, there's really no, definitive guidance on how much more time, but, you need to think about, pulling together crammable subjects, doing more question banks. And in both cases, you may be doing self-assessment exams, like this, our USMLE self-assessment exam, or your self-assessment exam, or the CBSSA or whatever, so you can get a bead on what your trajectory is, and we'll spend a little bit more time about that, in a bit. You need to know about also your study strategies and what you're going to use. Now, of course, many of you have taken very competitive exams or intense exams before, like in the U.S., the MCAT, or any qualified medical exam from whatever country you came from or trained in. So you've obviously gotten that far, right? But in addition, you need to know about the strengths and weaknesses of the subject, and the strengths and weaknesses of your curriculum as well too, so you can decide what goes well with it. I'm sorry, the characteristics. So, for example, pharmacology and microbiology, because of the way the information is organized, lends itself well to structured studying in tables, and also flashcards. Whereas things like physiology, which is more conceptually based and relationship based, you might have to have flow diagrams or mind maps or whatnot to understand the relationships. And same thing about trying to understand your curriculum, in the sense of what you might need to supplement based on what was well taught and not what was not well taught, right? You also need to think about the amount of time you'll be dedicating to a particular subject area system, right? All you will be probably dedicating a lot more time to something like pathology versus something like neuroanatomy, right? And so you'll be able to do certain things with pathology that you can't do in neuroanatomy, just given the time considerations. All right. So the next 5 to 10 minutes, I'm going to spend just walking through some of the high yield areas, on the USMLE by discipline. Obviously, a lot of this will translate well across organ systems. I'm not going to read through everything, but I'm going to definitely start pointing out, what the themes are as you go through all this, and they'll be apparent. The first thing that's thematic with everything is that they tend to gravitate towards concepts that have some sort of clinical relevance, which is interesting, right? Because this is called a basic science exam, right? But the good news, and I think it's a good thing, is that they tend towards concepts that have some sort of clinical relevance, which makes sense. Why are we learning all this basic science if we can't apply it in the human condition, right? In both disease and in health. Certain areas, can be, high yield because they're very constrained, or very, targeted. And also things, in terms of imaging, it tends to show up clinically, like X-rays and CTs and MRs. All right. So again, so again, just keep in mind, the clinical relevance, and you'll see that as you keep going. Right. Same thing with biochemistry. Now, biochemistry is crammable because, like micro and pharm, particularly with metabolic pathways, there are areas where the information has a pretty repeatable structure, right, in terms of the relationship, and so it's easier for you to learn, easier to cram, but also potentially easier for you to forget if you don't anchor it, carefully with pathology and other things. And again, remember, even in biochemistry, there should be some clinical relevance to what they're going after, right? And the other thing, and this is the other theme, is that they will start integrating with other concepts, as we talked about earlier with those multi-step questions, right? So a path condition, and then they actually ask about some, molecular disease mechanism that's tied to that, that condition, right? So think about how you can integrate biochemistry with pathology, or path with anatomy, or anatomy with physiology, and so forth. So again, that will be a recurring theme as I go through this. Micro is also, again, tends to be a little bit more crambled because of the repeatable, the predictable structure of how things show up, right? Like they typically ask about how do you diagnose the bug, what are the distinguishing laboratory characteristics, where does it go, how does it get there, how do you make the diagnosis, what are the vectors, what are the reservoirs, and so forth. So that's why it's crammable. Remember, it's not all about bacteriology. There's all kinds of other stuff as well too. And then of course, in this situation with a pandemic, it's so critical we know about the vaccine response, both in health and in disease, and immunopathologies like immunodeficiencies. Pathology, as I mentioned, is big, high yield, just because it's such a broad subject area, and it has a big chunk on the USMLE blueprint. They tend to have hallmark presentations for rare conditions, but they can vary the presentation into something very common, like asthma. So you can have a pediatric patient that shows up just with cough, because that often happens with cough-bearing asthma, or in kids. You don't necessarily get as much wheezing, for example, that you would expect with classic asthma presentation, right? They are going to, if they put in things like age, ethnicity, particularly with with how I think they may be approaching diversity and equity, inclusion, and all that, it usually is there for a purpose. But that being said, just remember that things that are classic doesn't mean that that's how it's going to show up, right? For example, you can have sarcoidosis, if you're not a black woman, right? So it doesn't always have to be a black woman who gets sarcoidosis. So those are, it could easily be a male, white male, but just don't let the classic presentations throw you off, right? So that's that's where you actually cite yourself. It's not that the USMLE is trying to trick you. Now, on a related matter with regards to buzzwords and stuff like that, yes, we use that in first aid, and there are other high yield resources that do it too, but it's mainly there as a mnemonic device. You still need to know the description, how it will present on the USMLE. So if you do enough questions in USMLE-Rx and other high quality question banks, you'll see the pattern, how they describe a lot of these findings, including the eponyms too, like Osler nose or Janeway lesions. They're not going to just say, hey, somebody presented with a Janeway lesion. They're going to describe it to you. You're going to have to figure out that that's what you're looking at. All right. Pharmacology, also crammable. Actually, I need to say one more thing. The last thing, I mentioned earlier that, obviously, some of the questions have photomicrographs and even videos and stuff like that. One of the key things, and the RX coaches, really stress that you need to have a deliberate approach to each of the questions. And we have a 7-step process that goes through it. But in that 7-step process, just make sure that you review the case before you look at the photomicrograph, because a lot of times, you don't know what you're looking at until you get some orientation from the case itself. And the other thing we often get is that we get from our authors and folks who've taken the exam that a lot of times you can often solve the diagnosis without actually looking at the image or the gross specimen. All right, pharmacology, again, one of these high yield areas, again, because they show up in very predictable ways, right? So they talk about mechanisms and toxicity. Now, the therapeutics, like the indications, like you use this for that disease, that a lot of that's been moved to USMLE Step 2 CK. That being said, they will still do toxicity, but the weird way they do it is they'll potentially give you the diagnosis, or they'll even give you the class of they'll even class of drugs, but they're going to be testing you on the toxicities or whatnot, right? That's typically due to a mechanism. It's a little weird. It's a little awkward. We've seen a bunch of it already. We've already adjusted our QBank to address that, but I'm just giving you a heads up. At a minimum, you're going to want to take care of the prototypical, particular drugs with the major variants. You never need to know even if you're going for that 250, you never need to know trade names unless you want to, remember just for a kind of as a mnemonic type way. And then you can also use, and you never need to know dosages either. And again, integrate, right? It's all about integrating all these concepts. Physio is also, as I mentioned earlier, tends to be concept oriented. So diagrams work well in terms of really trying to understand, those various physiological hormone relationships. And again, because of its close tie to pathology, it's almost one and the same, with regards to, the integration of pathology and physiology. All right, psychiatry. We in first aid mix it together with psychology, sociology, psychopharmacology. I'm sorry for our psych friends that we mash it together, but it's obviously for convenience. Now within that area, there are there are certain hierarchy that goes beyond the mood disorders, which is what we typically think about. And first aid, we do. I think we do a pretty good job, at least giving you a high level view of the landscape. Public health, right? Over the last year, classically you get things like biostats, epi. There is still some healthcare delivery and patient safety in quality improvement, but a lot of that's moving more towards step 2 CK. Biostats and epi is always high yield, but the big thing that started last year are the doctor-patient interaction questions in terms of how you present and so forth. It's different than ethics. It's more about communication skills. Right, ethics. There's a mix of light ethics, but you're going to see more heavy ethics on step 2 CK. And we have well over 100 questions and new questions in our bank that focuses on these doctor-patient interactions. So make sure you get practice with that. Obviously before you take the step 1. All right. So that was a whirlwind tour. There's obviously more to that. On our blog, I'll show you where this presentation is located, so you can get all the slides and actually get access to a previous video recording that goes through this, so that if you missed anything, you can come back and review. All right, now let's talk about review resources, right? Because we all find that there are gaps in how we prepare in medical school. Ideally, medical school is the same thing as the USMLE, but it's not. So it is what it is. And so there are text reviews, question banks, case review courses, and all kinds of digital apps and video apps and flashcard apps that help you, prepare for the exam. So the key thing is, how do you pick and choose these resources when you don't have time and when you don't have, a budget, right? And so there's a couple of things, and fortunately, a lot of this is free. So in first aid for the USMLE Step 1, we have our section 4. That's where we have the review resources. You can obviously pick that up in first aid. That's the short version. But we actually have a more detailed version that's available for absolutely no cost online at firstaidteam.com. I'll show you where that is. So go there, to get an orientation to the resources and a general set of recommendations. But once you decide what you're going to do, get your books and apps early. You might as well start using it with your classes or whatever your studies are. Try not to overbuy. Good news is a lot of these things are on demand. You can just subscribe to it on the web or on your app right away. Or you can get it in a couple of days on Amazon. So it's not a big deal. The last thing is that, particularly for book series or some digital series, digital tool series, they're better for certain things than others. That's just the way things are, right? Either because of differences in the subject matter being taught, or the authors or educators that are working on different parts of the series. So just remember to do your due diligence, and not accept everything blindly. That hey, what worked for me in pathology will work for me for pharm or micro and so forth. All right, great. So that's a little bit about study resources. So I'm going to ask one more question, which is based on what I just discussed, what resources are you or will you be using to prepare for the USMLE Step 1? It could be none of the above or all of the above. So, you can check all that applies, So I will leave this up longer because for whatever reason, like I said, it takes a little longer to collect the results. So it'll be, we'll give it 20, 30 seconds. So right now I have about 25% of you who responded. All right, we are up to 40%. Let's keep it going. Obviously some patterns are showing here, and we are close to 2/3, and I think that's plenty good. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the poll and show the results. And what you see is that, no surprise, everybody does a question bank, and most people do review books and videos as well too. A bunch of folks are doing flashcards; those are popular, and a lot of people are doing this mobile apps. But I can imagine that, for a lot of folks, particularly doing like a question bank or whatever, doing 40 questions, off your 5-inch phone can get a little tiring after some time. All right, cool. Very, very good. Let me, minimize that, go on. All right, so let's talk about some general study advice, and I know Sean and Bras will probably have some thoughts as well too. These are things that, that students have valued over the years in terms of helping them get through the Step 1. They're a little general, but these are all good, common sense type, rules and advice that have helped folks. One is, once you establish a study schedule, you should stick with it. We actually do have, on our blog, access to a free study schedule, but you can use that to structure study, but once you do, you should be able to stick with it and not make too many adjustments. And especially if you do certain things like not overschedule, right? Number two, you should integrate apply everything. We've been saying that all throughout, so I think that should be hopefully drilled in your head. Try to put it all together. The more steps you can put together, then the more you can really synthesize and get into the head of the exam writer. We mentioned about those crammable subjects like micro and pharm and metabolic pathways. That again, while you need to respect your curriculum and study along with your curriculum wherever possible, if you do have some latitude, especially in the weeks before the boards, you might review some of those crammable subjects right around then. Speaking of review, a lot of medical schools should help you prepare for boards. Obviously, that's what the USMLE is trying to test. And if you previously learned that material, definitely go back to that first, in preparing for the exam. As I mentioned earlier, do not overschedule. You are not a robot. You need time to relax, regenerate, and so forth, right? So make sure you get breaks, make sure you get exercise, make sure you have time to spend with your significant other or with family or friends and whatnot, right? Most people rarely can do more than a 10 to 12 hour day, before eventually getting into a potential burnout situation. So be careful. Try to take a day off a week, even during your dedicated study period. So you can decompress a little bit, and then also schedule in, in some of the study, schedule in time where you're gonna say, hey, look, I'm gonna review some, make sure you review something where that you can, schedule in some time that's not assigned yet, so then you can assign it later to areas where you feel like you're having some challenges, and that's gonna be high yield for the USMLE. As I mentioned, you wanna kind of really, take the long view, so stay relaxed and grounded. We do have a checklist in the front of the book that will help you stay on track, for the USMLE. I'll pause there and see if Sean and Paras have any other thoughts or advice that they've been discussing with their coachees, if you will, in the Rx Coach program.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dr. Lee. You know, one thing I will point out is we actually have on our YouTube channel a great webinar that Dr. Lee and Dr. Bakaria did about how to make a study schedule. So I encourage all of you to take a look at that. That being said, one of the most common things students ask us is help with making a study schedule. And we do that with all of our coaching students. One piece of advice I'll give you that we give all of our students is students always come to us and say, oh, my friend said to do this, or I read this on Reddit, or I saw this on a forum. And my advice to you would be a cautionary tale, which is what worked for somebody that posted something on the internet or worked for your friend may not necessarily work for you. The reason being is because we all learn differently, we all think differently, we all have different strengths, we all have different weaknesses, and we all apply what we know differently, and that translates into our test-taking skills and critical thinking skills. So if you really want a personalized study schedule, reach out to us at rx-coach.com, set up that free consult, and become one of our coaching students. We're happy to help you. If not, definitely check out the free video we have on our YouTube channel and check out the free study plan that's available at firstaidteam.com.
Great, fantastic. Yeah, if you can find that YouTube video, maybe you can drop the link into the chat box for the folks.
Sure thing, I'll do it right now.
Great, fantastic. Any other comments? All right, let's carry on. All right, so you know, the exam is what's called a CBT, computer-based test, right? So, and as I mentioned, they have that tutorial at the very front that you get 15 minutes for on the exam, and just do it ahead of time. There are keyboard shortcuts which most people don't use, but it's there just in case you need it. And with regards to the testing and the Q&A, you want to mix it through your entire studying, right? That's pretty obvious. We've been discussing right there, and there's a lot of science to back that. So so just in case you're always wondering why am I taking so many questions, doing so many Q banks and stuff like that? Turns out there's a lot of science to support that. Basically, researchers had students do study for a science text from a science text, and they did it in multiple different ways: the single study session, repeating studying, concept mapping, and then retrieval practice, which is just quizzing yourself. And people who quiz themselves did way better, and even did significantly better, even with more complex inferential questions. So that's called the testing effect, right? So you might heard a little bit in some of your learning how to learn courses, in vet school or even in undergrad. All right, so let's talk about practice options. What are the things that are out there, right? So there are, of course, free things like the USMLE sample exams, the free 120. It's all for format familiarity. They've updated a bit, right? But that being said, some of the items are, a little, may not be exactly what you see on the exam with regards to length and complexity. And some of the items are clearly a little older than some of the other items. But, it's good enough just to get you familiar, right? Now, with regards to benchmarking, the CBSSA that's offered by the ME, the Comprehensive Basic Science Self-Assessment. They have 6 or 7 forms out there. They're $50-$60. They now a lot of them have explanations, and so they can be helpful for diagnostic and benchmarking, right? Because they also give you a conversion to the predicted conversion to the USMLE Step 1. We can do the same with Q banks, right? Like RX, UWorld, and other resources out there. So they're good for practice, study. Some of them can be used for simulation, especially with the self-assessments that are 4 blocks. And in ours, we not only do we have the self-assessment, so we have a self-assessment 1 and self-assessment 2, but we also have the ability to create a full-day simulation with the questions in your question bank, right? So that can help you when you're trying to, figure out your energy levels and stuff like that, and pace yourself during a full day of test taking. All right, great. So now let's talk about what else do we know about the learning science. What does learning science have to say about how to prepare for the USMLE Step 1? So some of the researcher out there basically says, Q banks are more effective than flashcards, and that's not a surprise. That this data has been shown a couple of times. That you need to do less Q bank questions to get the same improvement. And the main reason why is that Q bank questions test that critical thinking process more thoroughly with their clinical vignette questions versus typical flashcards, right, which are more about memorization and recall, right? The next question that people often ask is, well, how many questions do you need to do quote unquote X points better on the exam? The general rule of thumb is 300 to 450 questions, practice questions, for every one additional point you want to improve on the board, controlling for things like MCAT and undergraduate GPA. So that's been shown in a couple of studies. How many questions do you want to do? Nobody really knows, but the one study from Michigan a couple of years ago showed that people who did more than 3,000 questions, the 3,200 questions, had the best performance versus those who did, like, say, less than 1,200 questions. What about repeating questions, doing unique questions? So you often hear that, hey, you should do X, Y, and Z Q bank 3 times and you're done. Turns out that's a bit of a potential myth. It turns out that the best way, to do this is to do unique, MCQs. So, so the people who did the best, they did 3,200 unique MCQs, not repeating those MCQs. Part of the reason why this is because when you're repeating the MCQ, you often deal with an issue called fluency. Fluency means it looks familiar to you, and you get this false assurance that you already know it. But the only reason why it feels familiar because you've seen it before, and sometimes you can get the answer not because of the question, not because you know any better, but because something in that presentation, something idiosyncratic tips you off, and you get it just because how it presented, and not the actual question itself. So keep that in mind. And then finally, in the study out of University of Michigan in 2017, they showed that students who did 3 passes or more with first aid, especially they could do with active learning, had a better USMLE score. And you're going to ask, well, how can you do active learning? Well, we for example have our USMLE-Rx flash facts, which have which tests all the content in first aid, and so and then we can also show you the actual first aid fact. So if you use that, then that can help you actively learn first aid as opposed to just highlighting it and just trying to brute force memorize it. Okay. All right. So that's the research. Some additional thoughts and comments with regards to test day. Just keep in mind that you're going to be very stimulated that day, so make sure that you manage your coffee carefully. You're going to be in a office center, prometric center that can be cold a lot of times. So be ready, dress comfortably with multiple layers of clothing. Again, the RX coaches, Sean and Faraz will drill you in making sure that you approach each question methodically. But one of the key things is, one of their key steps is that you're going to always read the lead-in, which is what is the question about, before you read the overall question. But even if you have your own technique, we still recommend that you do that, particularly for longer questions. With regards to managing the clock, as I mentioned, it's 90 seconds per question. We recommend that you get to at least a preliminary answer within 70 seconds of reading that question, because if you can do that, by the time you get through 40 questions, you only burn up 45 to 50 minutes. That gives you 10 plus minutes to go back. And if you mark a handful of questions that you think are solvable, you got it narrowed down to 2 options or something like that. You can go back and try to work on them a little bit more. Just remember, don't overmark it because you may not have enough time to go back and review them. with regards to food and snacks, obviously you're gonna, try to keep things, lean with, high energy foods, things that won't get you too sleepy. Minimize the carbs, and a lot of people just choose to snack. Go a couple blocks, take a snack. Go a couple blocks, take a snack, and you can again in USMLE-Rx create a full day exam and where you can practice where you want to take your breaks, where you want to do your snacks or your light lunch. And then finally, there's a joke we had in med school called the C reflex, because we do have those C nerve fibers, right? Which basically means, if you have no idea what's going on, which can happen, there are going to be some really hard questions here or there. You just choose your favorite letter, C, B, or whatever, and click it and go on. There's a couple of reasons why you shouldn't fret, right? One is a fair number of the questions are experimental questions. We don't know how many, but they could be in the dozens. And so, your hope is, and they do that because they're often using it as a diagnostic marker to make sure the test is performing well. They may be experimenting with new items and whatnot, and they may not be perfectly, well written at that point. And so if it looks weird or wacky or you have absolutely no idea, just pray it's one of those experimental questions, pick C or B, and then just move on, all right? Save your time for the questions that are solvable.